The wind is blowing about 45 miles an hour from the northwest. There's sleet in the air. There's about 2 or 3 wrecks on the way out. I don't know what, I think it's Sister Mary Margaret that did it all. I mean, because it's beautiful weather today. So we're blessed to have Sister Madeline Grace. Just to give you a little background, she's a published author, number one, but more famously, she's known to have taught your Deacon Bill Wagner in graduate school. She's survived that incident that occurred back in 1993, the fall of 93. 1993, the fall of 1993. She's never really been the same since, but I mean, she hides it well. She taught a course on the Fathers of the Church, which engendered in me a love for the Fathers of the Church. We talked about the development of the church last week, and so we brought you up to about the edge where the apostles leave off. Now come those that follow the apostles. And the sister's going to tell you about that vast number of those people who were called fathers of the church that spread across the centuries to about the 6th century, 7th century, something like that. And I hope that your experience, I'm not hoping, I know your experience is going to be beautiful. Sister's had some medical problems with her back for the past couple of years. She's been coming out. I think she's coming because she loves this program so much. And I don't know, it's a struggle to get here. So we so deeply appreciate it. Sister Madeline Grace.
While those handouts are being given to you, it's certainly a great privilege to be with you again. And yes, I think Bill survived and I survived over 3 years ago at St. Mary's Cemetery. So if we look at what we have in our hands, we have a map of what was the known world by way of Christianity. In other words, within the first 100 years, Christianity spread to what was seen as the known world. That is from Spain in the west, actually all the way to India in the east. And that rapid transfer of Christianity actually had to do with the 12 apostles and the great fervor which they experienced as a result of Pentecost. And so we all know that we find the event of Pentecost within the Acts of the Apostles. So we're going to be, we're having an unusual evening. We're going to be traveling through the important people that we have flowing from these very first years. So, okay, so as we can see, this is a map that we think of in reference to that first century, and a map which shows, as we said, the extent of Christianity as such. And so we are noting how rapidly it spread, as we said a moment ago, as a result of that very wonderful and, shall we say, powerful feast of Pentecost. We're going to be looking at those 12 apostles, and I'm going to be traveling back and forth with these slides, so I might exasperate you just for a couple of moments, but hopefully not for too long. So let's look at the third slide that you have on your sheet, and it's telling us a little bit about the 12 apostles. And I know that you referred to them last week. And as we note, Jesus specifically chose the 12, and he had particular, shall we say, plans in mind for each one of them. And as the sheet points out, number 12 had a lot to do with the 12 tribes of Israel. So 12, of course, is a very sacred number in reference to the scriptures. We note also that the 12 apostles were there for very important events. Your slide mentions the Last Supper, events which had to do with leadership, and so on. So it references a number of events in reference to the scriptures themselves. And as it says on number 3, all came from the northern region of Galilee, except for Judas. And as it points out, 2 of them actually were married, and we know that from the scriptures themselves, Peter and Philip. And we recall from the scriptures that when they were called by Christ, they followed him instantaneously. The fourth point refers, of course, to the descent of the Holy Spirit. We think of that as happening within Jerusalem itself, and we note that immediately after Pentecost, the 12, Judas being replaced by Matthias, are going to restrict their activity to the area right around Jerusalem, which we would think of as Palestine. In that last point, it reminds us that we don't know much about the 12 beyond Peter, and just a little bit about the others, James, John, and so on. As it says in that last point, we learn a little bit more from apocryphal material. Apocryphal material meaning material that was written after what we think of would be the Gospels, and material, unfortunately, which has information which is not always credible or true. But we do learn certain things from that material itself. Now, we're going to go back a bit and play Connect the Dot just for a few moments. And we'll just deal with a few of these apostles. So we know that number 1 is connected with Peter. We heard our reading tonight coming from Matthew's Gospel, and we recall that Jesus chooses Peter, Petrus, the rock, to be the leader of the church. And so as we look at our map, we see that what 2 sites have a 1 next to them? Rome is 1, and Antioch is the other. We all know that Rome becomes the site of the papacy and has been since earliest times. But anybody tell us why Antioch is connected with Peter? I think somebody was saying it back there. Peter was actually the first bishop of Antioch. We know in the Acts of the Apostles, when Stephen was stoned to death, a lot of Christians got cold feet, and so they went up north to the area of Antioch, and they needed a bishop, a shepherd, and of course that became Peter himself. If we go a little bit further in our slides, we have some shields. And these shields were frequently found in early cathedrals. When I say early, we're looking at a time period which we might think of as medieval. And these cathedrals were etched on the walls because a lot of Christians could not read. And so as we look at the first 5 what we would think of as shields, we can certainly learn a lot about Peter. What do we have on the first shield? Anybody tell us why it's connected with Peter? The keys to heaven and earth. We heard tonight about the keys to the kingdom of heaven and earth. And so it's referring to the authority of the papacy. What about that number 2? What about that number 2? Yes?
Peter was crucified upside down.
Peter was crucified upside down at his request. He didn't feel like he was worthy to die as Christ did. And of course, number 3, we have a combination of 2 symbols. Likewise, we find in a certain fashion number 4. What about number 5? What did Peter do that wasn't such a great thing? He denied Christ 3 times, and so we think of the cock crowing. All right, now let's look at number 2. We have John, and John is connected with, I see a 2 and a 2, and I 2. All right, so I see Patmos, Asia Minor, and Ephesus. Why Ephesus? Anybody? Someone's saying it very softly. Ephesus was the home of John. And we might remember that according to tradition, John brought Mary, the Blessed Mother, to Ephesus to spend her last days on earth. Asia Minor, of course, because Ephesus is found within Asia Minor. Why Patmos, that island in the Mediterranean? Anybody? Okay.
He was exiled in Patmos and wrote the book of Revelation.
Thank you. All right, so we see that John was told that he would not suffer martyrdom, unlike the others. And so when a persecution came along in the 90s, we see it said that he was exiled to that island of Patmos, so his life would be preserved. And it is there that he experienced a number of visions, which had a lot to do with the what we see and read in the book of Revelations. Okay, let's look at number 3. We see that 3 is James the Greater, and it's connected with Spain over there, and it is connected with Spain. That's all that's up there. Okay. There is actually another site, but we'll stop with Spain. Why is James the Greater connected with Spain? Anybody? James the Greater is supposed to have traveled there actually by the Mediterranean Sea and catechized the area, and he is going to epitomize that in reference to these shields. And so we see some seashells. We see what we normally think of in reference to a pilgrim, traveling bag and a staff. And then, of course, the hat that a pilgrim would often wear. What's the name of that pilgrim site in northern Spain that some people go to? One of the oldest pilgrim sites within Christianity. Anybody? Anybody? Pope Benedict went there when he was serving as Pope with his brother priest, and many other people have traveled that road. What's the name of this that's the road that we would think of? What's the name of the site where James' body is supposed to be buried? Some people are looking it up on their telephones. All right. You never have a good question in class because of phones. That's okay. All right, you'll tell us in a moment. All right. Okay, so we're going to stop here in reference to the shields, but let's just go back here for a moment. If we were to look at number 6, Thomas, he's known for going all the way to India, and we might recall that Mother Teresa of Calcutta was buried from the church of Thomas of the Apostle. He was known as a carpenter in reference to building churches when he got over there. And again, we see many other sites where the apostles traveled. So here we have James, and it's quite often seen that the place where James is killed is epitomized on a shield, and so here we have a sword. And so the site is Compostela, and so the site of Compostela in northern Spain. James is said to have visions of the Blessed Mother there. John, who we just mentioned a few moments ago, you see shield number 11 with a snake coming out of that chalice, meaning somebody tried to poison him unsuccessfully. We see that he preached the gospel. We think he ran a school in Ephesus. And again, a number of attempts on his life. We see that John's gospel has a symbol of an eagle, meaning that it is the most spiritually developed. Of course, it is the last gospel to have been written. So we note that we learn many things about the apostles from the scriptures, but many things, unfortunately, we do not know about them. We have stories, but we don't know that they are always true. So let's look at the top of this slide, and you notice it says Apostolic Fathers. And so we're talking about the time period of the 2nd century, maybe moving into the 3rd century. And as it says, people who had contact with the apostles. And so that gave them, shall we say, an inner knowledge of what the apostles were preaching and a more correct knowledge. Naturally, there were no printing presses, and so their information was basically seen by word of mouth or sometimes by handwritten documents. Notice it says they may have been instructed by disciples of the apostles. So we might think of individuals who might be a 3rd generation away from the apostles themselves. So all of them, we know, were spreading the gospel. Then we have what are referred to as the apologists. So that name today might not carry the same connotation as it did in the early church, but the apologist then was defending the faith. And they were defending the faith, as it says, before 313 AD, because in 313 AD, we note that Constantine is going to make Christianity the religion of the empire, and he's going to allow freedom of religion. So it was that time period of the first 3 centuries which were so difficult for Christians, and unfortunately we experienced many martyrs during that time. And so as it says, those who defended the teachings of Christianity, especially during the era of persecution. So some people wrote under assumed names. Some people were courageous enough to write their own name down, and if they did, they probably experienced martyrdom. What did I do? Let's see here. Okay. Okay. We're looking at the apologists now. Lost a little power, but I'll talk a little louder. Okay. So on the left, notice it mentions the epistle, which is another name for a letter to Dionysus. And so this is an assumed name, and it is a clever way of explaining the teachings of the church. And in this letter, we see that Christians were referred to as the soul of the world. And why were they the soul of the world? Because people looked at them and came to understand what the moral life was meant to be. And so they represented the inner life with God that all of us were meant to live. And so the epistle to Dionysus was dealing with some of the questions that people might ask. Another question they asked had to do with why did Christians all live together in the same part of the city? And that, of course, was support each other in living the faith. But for pagans, that made no sense because they were all over the place. And so again, that was a way of answering those questions. If we look at the next person,
Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2.
that was actually a real person. Justin was a convert. Justin was a convert from paganism. He came from Palestine, and he came to Rome. And there he started a school of brethren. And at the same time, he was teaching people of Christian faith. And as it says on the sheet, he wrote 2 apologies, or 2 defenses of the Christian faith. And then he wrote a fictitious dialogue with the Jews. So it was a dialogue with Tryphos. These are very valuable documents. Because if we look at 2 apologies, they tell us how Christians were celebrating the liturgy in the 2nd century. And so we came to know especially how they celebrated the Mass and how they celebrated baptism. And so those were quite instructive for us. In the dialogue with Trypho, he was answering questions that Jews had in reference to Christ. Why did we look on Christ as the Messiah when, of course, they expected an earthly king? So it was a kind of a dialogue, as it says, in reference to answering questions of Jews. On the other side, we have another fictitious name. It is Vinicius Felix, and it's referred to, the document is referred to as the Octavius. And so here we have some people walking along the Appian Way. One happens to be a Christian, one happens to be a pagan, and one happens to be the narrator. And so we see that as they start walking down the Appian Way, the pagan a kiss at a statue of Christians. And so the pagan would come back and say, I hear that you people are cannibals. You eat what they call body and blood. And of course, this gave the Christian the opportunity to explain what was going on in reference to the Eucharist. And so the awareness of, shall we say, some wrong understandings in reference to the Christian faith. This document is actually quite long, but it is an easy read, and certainly for a person who's not well educated, they can learn quite a bit about the Christian faith and not be put off by the terminology for them. Lactantius was kind of a historian. Notice it says 240, 320, with that C in front of it being circa. We really don't have exact dates in reference to these very, very early people. But you will notice that several documents are credited to Lactantius. And so he's trying again to help individuals basically come from a pagan background. So you notice that first one on God's workmanship. And so he's looking at the awe experience that we would have of nature. And he says that we should be full of awe when we look at the beauty of nature, and certainly that could never come from any human being. It certainly must come from God himself. So that first work actually looks specifically at the marvels of creation itself. We're trying to, okay, all right. So, wow. Okay. The next one, the Divine Institute, is a compilation of the theology which had been written up to that time. And so that's the reason why it has that term institutes next to it. And of course, Divine Institutes, meaning divine teachings. It's not, shall we say, written in the best terminology, but it is the first work to pull together the teachings of the church up to that particular time. The anchor of God is an attempt of Lactantius to point out that in the Old Testament, and likewise in the New, we describe God in human terms. And as we look at the Old and New Testament, we can see that God sometimes is angry and sometimes is merciful. It appears that he's changing his mind back and forth and so on. In fact, God is unchangeable, but God is explained by the authors of the scriptures in such a way that we can understand who God is. And so, again, a kind of human approach which is clearer for us. The death of the persecutors is a very valuable document because it tells us a lot about those emperors who were ruling Rome during the time of persecution. And so we came to know who was responsible for the death of who. So, as an example, we learn from that document that Peter was crucified upside down. And we know why he was crucified upside down from that document. So Lactantius gathered some very, very important information for us then. The phoenix is the name of a bird. And this bird was a pagan symbol of new life. And so for the pagan, this bird came and, shall we say, established a nest on a rock, and the heat of the sun just burned it to ashes, and out of those ashes came a little baby bird. So there, shall we say, reasoning behind new life. Christians took that and used it as a symbol of the resurrection. pointing out that, of course, Christ rose from the dead, conquering death, and pointing out that Christ is truly God. So this is one example where Christians took a pagan symbol and applied it to Christianity. And this made it a lot easier for those pagans, shall we say, to accept Christianity as such. We're lucky on that one. Okay, notice on the left, we have individuals who write in Latin because that is their native tongue. And you will see that these individuals lived in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. If you look on the right, we're noticing that these individuals spoke and wrote in Greek because that was their native tongue. And so Latin was the native tongue in the West, and Greek was the native tongue in the East. Prior to this time, many people spoke both languages, but by the time we see the centuries moving on, again, Latin in the West and Greek in the East. Let's look on the left. We see a person by the name of Hippolytus, and as it says, Hippolytus of Rome. He is known for a number of elements. Unfortunately, he is credited as being the first anti-pope. The first anti-pope in that he disagreed with one of the early popes because he thought that that pope was allowing individuals back into the church too easily after they had committed grave sins. But we know that Hippolytus made his peace with God, made his peace with the church, and found his way back to Rome after he was exiled. Of those pieces up there, the most important one is the apostolic tradition. The apostolic tradition, we actually didn't credit to Hippolytus till the late 1800s, but it tells us not only how baptism and Eucharist were celebrated, but it tells us a good bit about the sacrament of holy orders and some other elements pertaining to other sacraments. And it gives us the wording that was used in reference to these sacraments. So it's a very valuable liturgical document. Right below that, we have Tertullian. Tertullian is a kind of a mysterious figure. We know he comes from northern Africa. Yes, he is a Latin father. Yes, we know he was a jurist. We think, of course, he was a lawyer. He may have been a priest. We see below that a number of pieces credited to him. However, we think he wrote over 200 works. So these are just a few. And he is the first person actually to write a work pertaining to one sacrament. So you will notice down there, baptism, penance, marriage. And so he certainly was a person who was learned in the faith, which tells us that we think he was a priest. We see also his prescription dealing with heretics. And so we find that Tertullian has quite a bit of orthodoxy within him. However, we see that toward the end of Tertullian's life, he becomes somewhat stringent in his faith. And unfortunately, his last works are not orthodox. And so that tells us that we would have to read his last works with a kind of heavy sieve. So what do we mean by that? If we were to look at his work on penance, that is a perfectly orthodox work. But if we were to look at what he wrote 20 years later, we see that he says that the church does not have the power to forgive some sins, which of course is not true. We know that Christ, in, shall we say, ordaining the sacrament or instituting the sacrament of penance, gave the apostles the power to forgive all sins. And so, shall we say, he becomes too stringent, and unfortunately, we don't know whether he dies within or, shall we say, beyond the faith. Cyprian was a bishop, as we see, of northern Africa, Cyprian of Carthage, and you will notice he dies there about the year 258. Cyprian was a convert. He was a person who lived through persecutions and a person who lived through a number of divisions within Christianity itself. And so northern Africa was an area which was a kind of a challenge in reference to leading the faith. And so you will notice right below there, it has a work he wrote which refers to the last, concerning the last. And so there were individuals within his diocese who unfortunately had fallen away from the faith because they had offered incense to the gods. And they were trying to save their necks. They offered that incense so they could survive. But that meant, of course, that they had committed grievous sin, and so they had to make their way, hopefully, back into the church. Some of Cyprian's flock didn't want them to come back in at all. They said to Cyprian, forget them. You know, they're going to hell, that's it. And another group said, oh, Cyprian, just let them back in. And so Cyprian chose that middle course, which of course that they had to do penance. They had sinned grievously, so they had to atone for that. But we know that the church, we know that Christ is rich in mercy, and so he welcomes these people back. And so Cyprian is well known for that middle course. The second document that is mentioned, the unity of the church, Cyprian is trying to pull these groups together. And he uses the image of the seamless garment of Christ. We all remember the scene at the foot of the cross where the Roman soldiers chose to throw dice for Christ's garment rather than split it. And so, of course, we have that image of the seamless garment, which has been used by other writers since then. We know that Cyprian is remembered for many other elements within the church. He writes in some of his documents that they were baptizing on the 8th day after birth because Jews chose to circumcise on the 8th day. And then he said, as time moved on, we need to move baptism up to the 3rd day. And of course that had to do with infant mortality. But it tells us that in the early church, they baptized immediately after birth. And so the awareness of how important baptism was to the church faithful in those early years. If we look over to the right, we're looking at the Greek world, and we have listed there 2 individuals who were leading the school where people were studying to become Christians. So sort of an early day RCIA. And so we note over here, we have Clement of Alexandria. So he was only the second leader of that particular school. And you will note that his first document, which is listed there, is an attempt to win the Greeks over to the faith. And so it's quite an extensive document. And in it, he attempts to point out that the Christian way of life is so far superior to that of the Greek gods and goddesses. If we know anything about Greek gods and goddesses, they were quite brutal figures overall. The tutor is the example of Christ himself. Christ is the best teacher that we can think of. All we need to do is look at the Gospels and the marvelous imagery which Christ used. That third piece, as you can see in English, is referred to as the carpets because it's a number of short pieces which are put together coming from the hand of Clement. Origen is a very marvelous early scholar. He also wrote many works which were orthodox. but unfortunately, toward the end of his life, he strayed away from orthodoxy as such, and so we would have to be careful in reading his works. You notice the first one mentioned there, the text cloth. Origen collected various translations of the Old Testament. And we note that we think of the Old Testament in reference to Hebrew, but there were various forms of Hebrew, and so he put them side by side, and of course that was a wonderful treat to people who were involved in language at that time. The exhortation, First Principles was another attempt at compiling the the teachings of the faith in the early church. It is, shall we say, the best example thus far of moral theology. And so he attempts to point out what is necessary in reference to living a good moral life. The next one, Exhortation to Martyrdom, Origen wrote for some 2 individuals who were waiting for martyrdom. And he tried to give them the courage to accept the cross of martyrdom. Origen himself actually desired to be a martyr. He was the oldest of 8 children. His father actually became a martyr, but his mother, Origen's mother, prevented him from doing that because she looked at Origen and said, "You're the breadwinner now, you're not going to become any martyr." So she kept him behind. But he always desired to be a martyr. That, shall we say, event never really took place in his life. We see, as it says, he wrote a work on prayer, which is the first, shall we say, scientific study of prayer, and then he was known for a number of scripture commentaries. Unfortunately, Origen falls away from the faith in reference to a belief in transmigration of souls. We tend to connect that with the Hindu faith today. We don't know where Origen got that from, certainly not from Hinduism, but unfortunately we find it in his writings. We see that if you read these early writers, you need to know ahead of time in reference to where they would have fallen away from the faith. His scripture commentaries, to a great extent, are very good, but I will say that when Jerome was reading him later on and found out that he was in error, he had to pull away and realize that, again, he needed to be read with a kind of heavy sieve. All right. Now we move to the individuals who are all saints. And so where there's no specific list of all the Latin fathers or all the Greek fathers, there is a list of the great Latin and great Greek fathers. And so these are accepted around the universal church in that sense. And so, as we note, we would have to say that these individuals are all saints. They all lived within antiquity, which means within the first 6 centuries. Their writings were orthodox, and their writings had the approval of the church. And so this puts them in that specific category of great. Okay, so on the left, we have Ambrose of Milan. Ambrose actually grew up as a pagan. His father was a governor of an area which was in northern Italy. He himself followed in his father's footsteps and intended to become a Christian. He was actually studying in a program that we would think somewhat similar to what we have today. And then all of a sudden, the bishop of Milan was found to be guilty of heresy, which meant he was guilty of Arianism. And so the Christians of Milan came to him and said, "We need a new bishop." And Ambrose says, "Well, don't look at me. I'm not even a Christian yet." And they said, "Well, hurry up." And so he does eventually become the Bishop of Milan. And we note on the left-hand side up here, he was an extensive writer and an extensive preacher. People came from all over the place to hear Ambrose. He was certainly well schooled within the scriptures themselves. One person who came to hear Ambrose because he had heard that he was such a great preacher was Augustine of Hippo. And when Augustine heard Ambrose and he realized how he worked with some of the elements, especially within the Old Testament, he decided to go see Ambrose on a one-to-one basis. And eventually Ambrose was teaching him of the faith, and Ambrose will baptize him on Easter Sunday in the year 387. And so Ambrose's skill in reference to preaching certainly was a great, shall we say, gift to the church. If we note up here, I'm not going to take all of these because of time. You notice there's one more called Concerning Virgins. Now we are in the 4th century, and Ambrose is concerned about women who would like to become religious. And so he is going to establish, shall we say, circles of women who he will provide spiritual direction for. And he will write this document, which will be a kind of background for them. And of course, the person that he will image in this document will be the Blessed Mother. So as we can see, he lives from 339 to 397. It actually will be a couple of hundred years before we see religious orders of women getting started. We see he wrote on the mysteries. Those mysteries would be the sacraments, and it is the term used for sacrament in the East. And we can see why, because each sacrament entails faith. It entails belief. And in these works on the mysteries and on the sacraments, we see that he writes about baptism, Eucharist, and confirmation, which are the 3 sacraments of initiation. We think that those works probably came from some of his sermons, but we know that we are certainly very glad to have them within print. And we note also he writes on the sacrament of penance, and here we see how, again, penance is being practiced in the 4th century. The next person we have is Jerome. Jerome is well known as the scripture scholar, so to speak. And so he is going to be remembered for translations, and he's also going to be remembered for commentaries. So we see up here that there's not a whole lot below Jerome's name, but he spends his life working with the scriptures. Jerome comes from a wealthy family, the area that we would think of around Yugoslavia. Since he came from wealth, he was able to travel quite a bit, and therefore he learned languages, Hebrew, Greek, and of course he knew Latin. and he's going to learn a bit of Syriac. Those languages, of course, will be very helpful by way of translation. We also note, as it says up there, the Vulgate. The Vulgate is the Latin for the word tongue. Jerome is going to be the secretary for Pope Damasus, and he is chosen as secretary because he knows so many languages. And so Damasus is going to come to Jerome and ask him to translate the Bible into Latin. If we know something about the collection of books by way of the canon of Scripture, and we know that we start with the area of Palestine by way of Hebrew, and then we think of Alexandria as it gets translated into Greek. We're talking about the Old Testament. And then eventually the New Testament will be added, and some of that is, of course, going to be written in Greek and some in Aramaic. But the people of Europe by the 4th century could not read those languages. And so therefore, the translation into Latin. That translation was used by the church for many, many centuries. We see below that Jerome writes a number of letters, and these letters are generally going to be responses in areas which need an answer. I'm thinking of one example, and that has to do with the awareness that Mary, the Mother of God, is ever virgin. We have a number of examples in the New Testament where people question whether Mary was ever virgin. We might think of the one phrase, firstborn son. And so Jerome is going to explain that firstborn son really has to do with heredity. It doesn't mean that Mary had other children. And he will go on and explain a number of other phrases which are found in the Gospels, which are peculiar to the Jewish way of life. And so that was a very, very valuable document coming from Jerome. Jerome also, as it says, dialogue against the Pelagians. We're not sure exactly where Pelagius came from. We know that he was a heretic because he's going to deny the need for grace, deny the need for God's grace. Some people say he came from Great Britain. Some people say he came from Ireland. The Irish say he never came from Ireland, he came from Great Britain, because they would say that there was never a heretic on their soil. We really will find that out in the next slide. But Pelagius was a person that had to be corrected by Jerome, and so he will deal with the element of original sin, the awareness that due to the fall of the first man and the first woman, we know that our nature is weakened and through that fall, and so the need for what we would think of as God's grace through that marvelous sacrament of baptism. So the dialogue that he's going to deal with against the Pelagians. Sometimes you might hear someone say today, there's a lot of Pelagianism around today, meaning there's a lot of people walking around who are saying they don't have a need for God, meaning they don't have a need for God's grace. We all have a need for God's grace every day of our lives, and hopefully we have that openness and that sensitivity to accept God's grace as it is offered to us. That last piece, which is mentioned on illustrious men, was written by Jerome specifically to point out that most of the great works by the time he lived, and as you can see, he lives into the 5th century, were written by Christians. And so he was trying to point out the contributions of Christians to the world of literature at that particular time. And I believe he dealt with 87 particular works, which is quite a few when we're looking at the 5th century. Okay, so, all right, we're going to take a break.
Why don't we take a break, gather some food together, and perhaps come back and you can munch while Sister talks to you. Yeah. So we've done that before, haven't we? So, right, why don't we pray, and then we'll take us about what time up? Okay.
Those participants that are candidates already baptized. Bobby needs your baptismal certificate. Okay? Yeah. Dismissal also again this Sunday. Thank you.
What he said about baptism, all of those of you who are candidates for full profession means you have been baptized. And even though you were baptized in Lutheran, or Presbyterian, Baptist, whatever, perhaps you have a certificate somewhere. You can find a certificate. We'd like to have that, a copy, make a copy of it, so we have it. If you have been baptized in a small church and that church doesn't exist anymore, got taken out by a hurricane or something, we'll deal with that because that's sometimes the case. I mean, it happens. Or sometimes churches don't keep good records, so there will be no record of your baptism, even though you know you were baptized. So, hop on that as soon as you can. Don't let it hang, okay? Questions? If you have a particular question about your own particular yourself, I'll try to help you out with all of that, okay? All right, why don't we stand and pray? Give you about 15 minutes to be back.